Hi, welcome to Dig Into China. I'm Dong Xiong. Today's program will once again shed the light on the issue of the Chinese Communist Party's manipulated economic data. Over the past 2 years, the extent of data falsification has become increasingly severe. This suggests that China's actual economic situation is quite poor. Faced with no other options, they have resorted to increasing the level of data manipulation to mislead Xi Jinping. It's a case of misguided ruler being surrounded by deceitful ministers. In this video, we'll examine import and export data, which is among the most difficult to fabricate, to detail China's methods of manipulating trade statistics. In early June, the Chinese Communist Party proudly announced that China's import and export figures for May were strong. Measured in US dollars, imports increased by 1.8% year-on-year, while exports grew by 7.6%. State media highlighted that China's exports to the United States saw a 3.6% growth in the first 5 months of this year, effectively countering the decoupling narrative between China and the US. But is this really the case? This leads us to the first commonly used method by the Communist Party to manipulate the data, adjusting down the baseline from last year. Let's tackle a simple math problem. Given that China's total export value for the first 5 months of this year is $1,400 billion and $700 million with a 2.7% year-on-year increase. What was the baseline for last year? The calculation gives us $1,363 billion and $900 million. Now, if we examine the import and export data published by Chinese Customs for May last year, we'll find that the reported export value from January to May was $1,400 billion and $400 million. This figure is lower than the one we derived from tracing back using the latest data, indicating that the CCP quietly adjusted down last year's baseline by $36.4 billion. This adjustment is what makes this year's export growth appear to be 2.7%. If we don't adjust the baseline downward, a comparison between this year and the last year's import-export data reveals that in the first 5 months of this year, China's imports increased by over $20 billion, while the growth in exports is almost negligible. Consequently, the trade surplus has decreased by over $20 billion. Examining the data for May of this year, we'll observe that both import and export baselines have been uniformly reduced by around 1%. Applying the same approach to analyze import-export figures for the previous 2 years will reveal two consistent patterns. Firstly, all the base data has been adjusted downward. There are no instances of upward adjustments. This serves a clear purpose to artificially boost the growth rate for the current year. Secondly, the magnitude of baseline reductions is growing. Last year, it reached a point when even Bloomberg found it unacceptable, writing articles condemning China's substantial downward revisions of import-export data, which broke historical records. This trend underscores the declining credibility of China's data with each passing year. Here is another piece of data to contradict the narrative. China's exports to the United States. According to Chinese officials, China maintained a 3.6% growth rate in export to the United States in the first 5 months of this year. However, it's worth noting that last year, China's exports to the United States actually decreased overall. So it might seem like relations between China and the US have improved this year, and the idea of decoupling between the two nations has diminished. However, even according to data published by the Communist Party itself, when measured in renminbi, exports to the US increased by 3.6%, but when measured in US dollars, which is the more globally accepted metric, exports to the US only grew by 0.2%. Looking at the data from the official websites of the US government and comparing it with China's import-export figures, the reality becomes clear. The US has only released the data for the first 4 months of trade with China. So let's focus on these months. From January to April of this year, US exports to China totaled $48.4 billion, while imports from China reached $129.3 billion. Contrasting this with last year's figures, the US reported exports of $51.8 $8 billion and imports of $132.6 billion. Consequently, both exports to and imports from China have decreased according to US data. Exports have decreased by 6.6% and imports have decreased by 2.5% year-on-year. Looking at China's trade data for the first 4 months of this year compared to that of the United States, we observed the following. China reported total exports of $152 billion, reflecting a 1% decrease year-on-year, while imports amounted to $54.5 billion, indicating a 5.7% decrease year-on-year. Thus, we are once again astonished to find that China's trade figures with the United States are higher than those reported by the US. According to China, the discrepancy in trade figures between China and the United States is due to differences in statistical methodologies. However, what strikes me as peculiar is that when comparing China's import-export data with major trading partners like Vietnam, Taiwan, and the United States, China's unique statistical methods consistently produce higher numbers, regardless of the comparison country. Yet, the trade data between Taiwan and the United States, as disclosed by both governments, exhibits minimal variance, suggesting a harmonization of statistical methodologies for imports and exports between the two. This raises the question, why does China persist in employing a distinctive approach rather than embracing the conventional import-export statistical methods used by other nations? Moreover, it's quite perplexing that China's unique method consistently yields higher trade figures than those reported by other countries. Doesn't this pose an intriguing puzzle? After covering data manipulation, let's shift our focus to the changes in the structure of imports and exports. Here lies another set of secrets that cannot be overlooked. In May of this year, China experienced significant increases in both imports and exports. Now, let's examine which goods saw a major surge in trade volumes. Begin with exports. We noticed that the growth primarily occurred in items such as machinery and electronic products, including integrated circuits and manufacturing equipment. On the other hand, direct consumer goods such as agricultural products, fertilizers, footwear, ceramics, and smartphones saw a decline in exports. This trend strongly resembles a scenario where factories are relocating exporting equipment while reducing the export of finished consumer goods. So, does this export structure suggest that the factories are indeed moving overseas? It seems unlikely that such a structure can sustain export growth in the long run. Moving on to imports. Changes in import structure often reveal whether there is capital flight occurring. For instance, in the first 5 months of this year, there was a sudden 11.9% increase in the import of high-tech products. Whether these high-tech products are genuine is something only the parties involved would know for sure. One common method of capital flight is to suddenly import high-value products. As long as these products are packaged with a high-tech facade, their prices become unquestionable. I recall at the end of last month, during a meeting with entrepreneurs, Xi Jinping posed a question. Why is the number of unicorn companies in China declining? This inquiry suggests that Xi Jinping has been misled by various illusions. His understanding of the Chinese economy seems to be confined to what is portrayed in China's official news. Despite occasionally acknowledging that China's economy is facing challenges, however, it's evident that he doesn't fully grasp the severity of this issue. Within the Communist Party, a significant tool used to deceive the leadership is the comprehensive fabrication of economic data. After all, deceiving Xi Jinping seems to be quite straightforward. It's often said, if you don't have the skills, don't attempt the task. A dictator who lacks a complete understanding of economic operations finds himself in a bind. He is hesitant to delegate full economic authority, yet incapable of handling such complex tasks himself. Consequently, he becomes a mere puppet, easily manipulated by those who manipulate economic data to mock his ignorance and incompetence. Who's to say that these technocratic bureaucrats aren't using this method to mock Xi Jinping's lack of knowledge and ability? Having supreme power means nothing if you are still trapped in an echo chamber of misinformation, ultimately destined to be condemned by history. So now I realize perhaps the primary aim of the Communist Party's data fabrication isn't to deceive us ordinary citizens, but rather to dupe Xi Jinping, as he is unlikely to detect any problems from the economic data. Thank you for watching. Please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. Just click the subscribe button right here. I'll see you again shortly. Until then, be well.